Good morning, welcome to Hot Seat, and welcome to someone who needs no introduction, our United States Senator James Lankford.
Thanks, Scott.
Good to see you, Senator.
Good to see you as well.
We have two, by the way, but you are a
We
Senator.
do have two, that's correct.
It's good to have you in this morning.
Thanks.
Let's start with a question on everybody's mind this morning. Do you have any classified documents in the trunk of your car?
I do not. Not in my trunk, not in my glove box, not in my garage, not anywhere in the house. I can tell you that with great confidence because I never leave the building with a classified document, ever.
That sounds like a good practice. So let me ask you this, and on a serious note, we've seen first President Trump, then President Biden, Vice President Pence, and now this is a very political issue, and a lot of people are looking at this going, I don't understand this, the difference between the types of classifications, all this. Can you help us understand what this means?
Yeah, there are different types of classifications. There's sensitive, there's classified, there's top secret, there's compartmented. All of them have different meanings, and it's just because it's a classified document doesn't mean, for instance, I could walk in and go, I want all the classified documents in the world, let me read them. Because you have to be connected to that document or a reason to be able to look at that to be able to go. And each document is not always classified for the entire life of that document. It may be classified information now, but later it may come out in other ways publicly, and so they go back and declassify that. Now, classified documents don't have disappearing ink, so you can't have suddenly the classified markings disappear on it, but it actually is declassified, though it still has the old classified documents on it. So it is a confusing issue at times, and that's part of the investigation that's going on right now, is to find out in these three places were those documents actually classified, or are they just marked classified? If so, were they compartmented that they're highly sensitive, or were they just what they call just sensitive documents that basically they just don't want to be able to talk about? So there's a lot of questions that are still out there, and quite frankly, the Senate Intelligence Committee is already asking for all that information, and they're going to get it.
All right, so we'll be able to see an FAQ at some point about
Yes.
how to understand this.
There
Well,
will.
we know that it's very politicized because whoever found the latest documents that shouldn't have it, the other side starts screaming about it. What can we discern through all the noise about how important this is to people that watch programs like this? Go, how does it matter to us?
Yeah, well, classified documents need to remain classified, and they're classified for a reason. It's not just that the information is private, it's often how we gathered that information. There may be an inside source in another country that we're working with, that there's only one way to know that information, and if the information got out, that government, let's say that it's the Iranian government, they would know there's only one person that knew that information, and they would go kill them.
Okay.
So that's why protecting classified information is especially important, because you're protecting what's called sources and methods. How did we get that? Because they can, if we have that information, they'll try to figure out how did you get that information, and it could cost someone their life.
Okay, we'll look forward to a resolution on that.
Yeah.
But one of the items I hope we could get a resolution at some point is the border. You just came from there. Those of us who study history look back on several administrations about what a problem this is. But right now, today, what is the situation on the border, and are we ever going to get this thing resolved in terms of policies that we agree on?
Yeah, it's still a mess that's happening on the border right now. Last month, we had 250,000 people that illegally crossed the border in December. Now, why that's significant is that's a record high number. That's a huge number again. And in December, typically the number goes down significantly. And quite frankly, the Border Patrol counts on it going down. It's Christmas time. And a lot of people don't travel during Christmas time, even illegally crossing the border, as strange as that sounds. So every year it dips in December, except for this year. It continued to be able to rise. The Border Patrol there tell me it's like living through a hurricane every day with just the number of people that are coming. The policies changed the very first day of the Biden administration. They announced that ICE was not going to deport anyone anymore. So even people in the country that had a criminal record, or people that were in the country that the court had already given what's called a final order of removal, they weren't going to actually be removed. ICE has a record low number of people actually being deported from inside the country right now. At the same time, the Biden administration changed the rules for coming into the country for asylum determinations. If people cross the border right now and say, I have fear in my country, no matter what country they're coming from, no matter where they are, they come into the United States, they're given a work permit within 3 weeks to be able to work in the United States, and they get in line for an asylum hearing that's now 10 years long. If you want to come legally into the country, there's a long process to come legally in the country, and once you do get legally here, it's 6 months before you get a work permit. So literally what the Biden administration has set up as an incentive to come into the United States illegally rather than legally. So we're having folks now pay the cartels in Mexico to be able to come across the border illegally so they can quickly get a job in the United States. rather than actually doing this the legal way. I don't run into a lot of people that have a disdain for legal immigration. Our country celebrates and our state celebrates legal immigration. We just have a problem with anything that begins with illegal. The other part of this is, if you legally come into the country, we know who you are, we know the background, we know why you're coming. If they're crossing illegally into the country, we have no idea if they're running from justice or running from poverty. We have no idea. When I was at the border just now 3 weeks ago, in one section of the border in El Paso, we were there on a nighttime patrol with our Border Patrol, and we watched two mounted Border Patrol, I should say, actually chase down two folks that were running across the border that ended up being Chinese nationals. These folks are coming in from all over the world, and we don't know who they are. And it's important that we have a controlled border. That should not be a radical concept to have a controlled border.
So for several administrations, this issue has bedeviled people. And let me just go back to I was thinking about Isaiah the other day. Come, let us reason together. If this bedevils parties, both parties, multiple administrations, how do we get to a situation where people of good faith sit down, reason this out, get something done?
Yeah, well, you do it in the daylight. These gang of eight, these gang of whatever, that they're going to quietly come up with a bill and throw it out there. That's not the way to do it. You come through the committees, you let the whole country see the process and know what's going on, and you try to be able to work out options. I've got several border bills that I'm going to be releasing in the coming days that deal with aspects of border security and say these are major problems that we have that also need a legislative fix. There are gaps or loopholes in the system that are being exploited. So we need to be able to close all those loopholes to be able to make sure that we can do that. They're not ideas that I would look at as particularly partisan. They're just national security issues on it. And so we're going to continue to be able to roll those out, because I want people to see them and say this is a good option. John Cornyn from Texas has a whole series of those. There'll be other folks that will roll out different sets of ideas. They should go through the committee process and be resolved. The Supreme Court is ruling on DACA sometime this spring. That will be a moment that there'll be more conversation that will happen nationally. That should be a moment that the Congress should sit down as well and say, how do we resolve these issues? The biggest problem with immigration and Congress is Congress works on a deadline, and there is no deadline to solve immigration. Everyone knows it's a problem, but it's also extremely noisy. Every time you start working on immigration policy, one group starts screaming amnesty on everything, doesn't matter what it is, and they're going to just shut down, and it maintains the bad status quo that we have. Another group starts screaming, you're taking Latina grandmothers out of their home where they've been 20 years and you're thugs. So once both those groups start screaming, Congress just stops and just the status quo remains, and the status quo is untenable.
You have an interesting guest you're going to have at the State of the Union.
I am. I'm actually bringing to the State of the Union Brandon Judd. He is the head of the Border Patrol Union. He represents all Border Patrol agents across the entire border, both north and south. And he's been a frequent guest on a lot of different television shows and such as well. I've met with him quite a few times along the border. He's the one who speaks to all of us in Congress and says, here's the real problem that we're facing on the border. He's the one that would say it's a hurricane every single day on the border. Our families are taking the abuse on this. And individuals that came to do law enforcement are now hotel check-in people because they can't actually do law enforcement. So I'm bringing him because he deserves, just like the rest of the American people, to hear the president speak at the State of the Union address and say, here's how we're going to solve the border.
There's another hot place in the world over there in the Middle East. You just came from there, and that was a bipartisan delegation. Tell us why that's important for us to know about.
So I went over to the Middle East, was in Morocco, which is North Africa, then United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Israel to be able to meet with the key head leaders of all of those countries on something called the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords were the first Middle East peace agreement that we've had in decades and decades. It came at the very end of the Trump administration. The Biden administration kind of dithered for a while to figure out if they're going to keep that going. They did decide, yes, they're going to continue to be able to keep that focus going. Meeting with those leaders in those countries, they all said this is the single most important peace agreement they've had in their lifetime. And I do think we'll be telling our grandchildren about the Abraham Accords, just like many people talk about what Jimmy Carter did with Sadat in Egypt, and trying to be able to bring some sort of stability between Israel and Egypt. We have to resolve those relationships between Israel and the rest of the Middle East. That's gone on too long. Realize Israel's been a nation 75 years, and there's still this ongoing fight where many countries in the region don't recognize their right to exist. As long as that's out there, there's this continued cold, stale, not peace, but not war either among all these countries. With the Abraham Accords now, There are flights that are happening. They're talking about energy together. They're talking about water together. They're talking about healthcare together, education together. They're doing commerce and investing back and forth on it. It's been a rapid acceleration of relationships between those four countries, and it's attracting other countries in the region to say, we want to be able to join into that. We want to help fan that into a good flame, to get a warm peace in that region, to allow folks to be able to engage. That's one issue, dealing with Israel and the relationships of everyone else. The second one is Iran. Every single country we went to and that we visited with, their leaders said the single biggest issue we have in the region is Iran. Iran and their terrorism and their proxies continue to attack every country in the region and to oppress. And while as Americans, sometimes we look at the Middle East and go, it's 10 time zones away, it's no big deal, that doesn't affect us. What Iran is doing in the region, destabilizing the entire region, and what is happening there in that region, and them attempting to try to come back to a peace again, is very significant, both to our national security, to our economic prosperity and security, and also our security here just day to day. Iran is sending assassins into our country to try to take out key leaders in our country. They've been very key about that. What they're doing in North Africa to try to destabilize North Africa with Hezbollah, with Hamas, with Islamic Jihad, they're sending weapons into fight against Ukraine, what they're doing to destabilize Lebanon. They're the destabilizing force there, and it's important that we maintain a relationship there with those countries that want to have a relationship with us, and they do want to have a relationship with us, that we continue to be able to work with them to try to figure out what we're going to do with Iran and to prevent them from having a nuclear weapon.
Let's talk about domestically something that is on everybody's mind for those who invest or just working for a salary or whatever down the road, the debt ceiling.
Yeah.
We are watching the storm clouds rumble back in 2011 during the Obama administration when there was a showdown. Speaker Boehner, they finally came to an agreement, but they went to the precipice. And those of us who watch the financials, the financial folks and the people on Wall Street are going, man, this could be, if there's not something done with this, it could be catastrophic to our economy. Your thoughts about where we're heading? The Senate seems to be much more, I don't know if the word's reasonable, but the House has got new leadership and some folks who really, really want to have a big showdown with the presidency. For those of us who are at home just trying to live our normal lives and they see this, what kind of words of peace can you speak to us on?
Sure, yeah, glad to. Let me give you a couple of things. The United States is the only country in the world that has a debt ceiling vote. Other countries don't do this. We do it for one reason. We believe that when you raise your debt ceiling, you should actually talk about debt. It's the whole reason that it exists, that the country should pause for a moment and say, how do we stop adding so much debt into our nation's economy? 10 years ago, we had $10 trillion in total debt. Now we have $31 trillion in total debt. I believe, like many others, we should be pausing to say, how do we make this stop? Because it's rapidly accelerating with the amount of debt that we have as a nation. It's not that far back to look back at Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan's presidency is when our nation crossed into having $1 trillion in debt. So from Ronald Reagan, $1 trillion, to 10 years ago to $10 trillion, now 10 years later to $31 trillion, we're seeing the acceleration. It is entirely reasonable to have a moment to say, how are we going to get out of this? We're not going to get out of this in a year or even 10 years, but we've got to change the trajectory of adding more debt into the economy. Responsible parents actually take care of their kids. We're not being responsible parents at this point. We're looking at our kids and going to make the economy and the situation worse for our children than they are for us. That's selfish of us as a generation. We should pause to be able to talk about this. Now, the debt ceiling. Everyone says you can't mess with the debt ceiling, and President Biden has already stepped up and said, I'm not going to negotiate at all around the debt ceiling. It's just got to be raised no matter what. That's not a rational position, to tell you the truth. And I think most Americans will look at it and go, well, we do need to talk about something. There does need to be some conversation. Now, if what the House proposes out there is some giant set of cuts that slams the economy down and everything else, I understand that. But if what they propose, or what I think they're going to propose, are structural changes on how we actually do our budget process, everything else, to change the direction for us long term, that's a smart thing to actually do. So I've been a big proponent for one of the issues that the House is even talking about as well. They were talking about my bill. That's a bill that's ending government shutdowns. We shouldn't have the threat of government shutdowns. We should have a moment where we all get together and negotiate this and to be able to resolve it. I have a bill, it's a bipartisan bill, to be able to resolve that. The House is talking about one of the solutions on the debt ceiling vote, adding that bill to the mix to say, okay, let's end government shutdowns while we're also talking about doing the debt ceiling issues. because that allows us to have more conversation about budget issues in a reasonable format rather than the crazy emergency of a government shutdown. So there's some reasonable things that can be done, should be done around the debt ceiling. We have about 6 months to be able to talk about this. It's not like it's in 6 hours. So we've got time to be able to negotiate this out, and we should, quite frankly, for the future of the country.
So you believe that we won't have to go to brinksmanship to get something done?
No, I didn't say that. I think we will. I think it will go all the way to the end on it, but I think the next 6 months we can talk about all the proposals, start whittling it all down, and at the very end there's still going to be this moment to say, okay, what the 1 or 2 final things that we're going to negotiate in or out to be able to get this. At the end of the day, we do have to have a debt ceiling increase. We are the United States of America. We have to be responsible in how we take care of debt and interest and all those things that we do. But also saying, we also can't just say it ruins our economy if we don't raise the debt ceiling. It also ruins our economy to keep adding more and more debt. We've got to do both.
Well, it's eye-opening, and you don't even need coffee to be sitting up straight and listening to that message. Senator, thanks for dropping by.
Bet.
And there's a lot of big issues this coming session, and best of luck to you.
Thanks. Appreciate
Thanks for
that very
being
much,
here.
Scott.
Thanks for watching Hot Seat. See this again at news9.com/YourVoteCounts. Follow me on Twitter @MitchellTalks.